What does it mean to be called crazy in a crazy world? Listen to Madness Radio, Voices and Visions from Outside Mental Health. Sponsored by peer-run support communities Freedom Center, The Icarus Project, and Portland Hearing Voices. Madness Radio can be heard on FM stations on the Pacifica Radio Network and is online at kboo.fm/madnessradio. Welcome to Madness Radio. This is your host, Will Hall. Today, my guest is Krista MacKinnon. Krista is a family counselor who worked for 7 years with the Family Outreach and Response Program in Toronto, Canada, focusing on youth going through what is called a first break psychosis. Today, she is a counselor in private practice, a mental health consultant, and a trainer at practicerecovery.com. She's also a psychiatric survivor of a bipolar diagnosis. So welcome to Madness Radio, Krista MacKinnon.
Hi, Will. It's nice to be here.
It's nice to have you, and we actually did another interview with you a few years ago, so if people want to go a little bit more deeply into your story, they can check out the archives on madnessradio.net. And I'm really interested in having you on the show because this comes up a lot, the role of families in helping people through madness, through extreme states. Some of us find that we need to separate from our families, but other times the family is very deeply connected and everyone really goes into a crisis. And you have a lot of experience working with that through the Family Outreach and Response Program in Toronto, Canada, which is really, I think, one of the most innovative family programs in the world that I've come across. And your own interest in working around extreme states and madness and working with families and working with young people going through extreme states, that began with your own experience with bipolar diagnosis. Is that right?
Yeah, that's exactly right, actually. I initially found a job that was in a drop-in center for psychiatric survivors, and the job posting said psychiatric survivors are encouraged to apply. And at that time, I had never even heard that term, and I was kind of taken aback by the term. And for the first time, that just seeing those words together helped me to place my experience differently of being in the system.
So you got really involved with the peer movement and the psychiatric survivor movement by getting hired into an agency position, it sounds like.
I mean, I was diagnosed when I was 16 and I was hospitalized and forced into treatment at 16. And I pretty much just didn't buy into it. I had moments of buying into it, but for the most part, I didn't really believe any of it. So I wouldn't have ever involved myself in any kind of anything relating to mental health. I really just kind of tried to shut the whole experience out because I just didn't buy it, basically. And it was only when later I saw that job posting with the word psychiatric survivor, it occurred to me that, there might be other people like me out there who felt they were not treated properly or misunderstood rather than having this mental illness thing.
I think you're right. I think there are a lot of people who are thrown into the system, they come out of it and they just walk away from it. And we don't ever hear from those people because they're not involved in agencies or treatment or they're not being researched.
For sure. I mean, I would hear from those people a lot as a family counselor because I would hear from their families who, often the people who were diagnosed and once they've left the hospital, they believe they're doing well. It's the family that has been informed by the medical community, by the nurses, by the social workers that, it's their job, the family's job to make sure that their relative continues to take their medication and stays on the treatment path.
Is that what happened to you, that your family had a very different view than you did when you came out of the hospital?
Yeah, I mean, I think my family did what classically most families do, which is they get their education about mental health issues, about what gets called mental illness from the medical system, from the hospital. And so my family was told that I had a biological brain disease that required, in my case, lithium to correct the brain disease, and that I'd have to take the lithium for my whole life. And that I'd always have to be on guard, and they too would always have to be on guard for symptoms of any kind, even with the medication. There was no education for my family around recovery or wellness or what it might look like to put it behind me. It was just sold to my family as a lifelong thing that we would have to cope with.
And how did you first end up in the hospital? What was it that happened? Were you in some kind of altered state or some kind of crisis?
If you had asked me at that time, I definitely would not have said I was in crisis, but I was hospitalized at 16, but when I was 14, I was very depressed and I was preoccupied a lot with thoughts of suicide and I was a very dark person. And my family took me to the doctor who said, she's fine. It's just regular teenage angst. But then I got sort of caught up in doing drugs. And then when I ended up being hospitalized at 16, it was because I was really out of touch with reality and I wasn't sleeping and I wasn't eating. And, for several days at a time, my thoughts were very discombobulated and I had a lot of really unusual beliefs.
So at 14, you were very depressed and suicidal. Do you know why that was the case?
Having worked in the field for a long time, I'm more aware of trauma-informed practices, and I know that I experienced trauma as a child. I don't remember it still much to this day, but I more think that there's a link to what was happening to me during puberty and the sexual abuse that I had when I was young than I used to, because I used to really just, I don't remember any of it, so it doesn't affect me. My understanding of trauma has evolved to a point where I'm not quite sure exactly how it all pieces together, but I do think that might have had something to do with, during my puberty years, blossoming into a woman, having sexual abuse as a child might have, been related to my depression.
And so at 16, it sounds like things started to unravel a bit with not eating and not sleeping and taking drugs like marijuana, like psychedelics, or what was going on? Was there anything that sort of triggered that? Or
I did smoke a fair bit of marijuana. I never liked it. It's still a mystery to me why I kept doing it. Maybe it was peer pressure, but it wasn't something I particularly enjoyed. It would make me very paranoid. So I would see everybody around me laughing and having fun, and I would smoke weed and I would just be very, very paranoid. I would believe that everybody was out to get me. There were people behind me following me. People were like eavesdropping in on my conversations, this sort of thing. But my drug of choice that I enjoyed was more in the psychedelic realm. But it got to the point where even if I wasn't on psychedelic drugs, I would be hallucinating and seeing things and kind of, hearing things and just having very confusing experiences. And the fact that I wasn't on drugs but was still experiencing it was very unusual to me. So I didn't quite know what to do with that. So what I did do was I stopped doing drugs because I wanted it to stop because it was a little bit freaky. I believed that I was going to be famous. I would see magazine covers and I would believe that I was the person on the cover of the magazine. My maiden name is Binkle, and there was, Christy Brinkley on the cover of In Style magazine or something. And I thought that was me. And I would get very engrossed in watching nature in a way that was unusual. Like I would sit in the middle of the street and I would, watch the bugs crawl on the pavement and talking very quickly. I would make a lot of sense out of numbers. I would piece together numbers and make sure that somehow that was connected to my divine mission. And I believed I was, incredibly brilliant. And I wrote all of this poetry and I made it into a book and I bound it with yarn. And I went to go apply for a job at the Dairy Queen with my my handmade book of poetry, which is not a skill set required for working at Dairy Queen necessarily. So just unusual things. So most people who talk to me for any period of time, 2 or 3 minutes even, would know that I was not my usual self, I guess you could say.
And then at what point did you end up being forced into treatment?
I was staying with my friends at the time. My family was away on a vacation, and they had left me with very close friends of the family, my best friend and her parents. And I just kind of ran away from their home, and I packed up my guitar, and I was heading to Toronto, where I was going to go live on my own and do my own thing and be the famous superstar that I was. I don't really remember a lot of it. And even right when I was 17, 18, I didn't remember a lot of it because my state was just so heightened. But I know that I was picked up, I think, by my friend's parents who took me to the hospital. And, behind the scenes, there was stuff going on that I don't know about. Like, I'm sure they called my family and, decisions were made that I was not privy to. I remember I was walking down the mountain in Hamilton from the West Mountain to downtown trying to catch a bus. And then her family picked me up in their car to take me to the hospital, basically.
So you spent some time in the hospital. You came out of your state, and it sounds like maybe getting you to sleep was one of the main things that helped you to come out of your state. And then what happened next? Getting
me to sleep and getting me to eat both, because I wasn't doing either, because I had this belief that all the food was contaminated and poison, and so I wasn't sleeping or eating. So eventually, I did come out of my state, and I was allowed to, I started with day passes, and then I got a week pass, and eventually I was able to go home and be with my family again. And my family had gotten their education from the hospital. And, we did the whole family meetings, and my family went to do the family support group stuff. And they were told by my psychiatrist and the treatment team to make sure that I stayed on my medication pretty much at all costs. And that was, as my parents, that was their job, to keep me healthy and safe and keep me on my medication. So my family had said to me, Krista, you need to take these medications if you want to live in our home, basically. And if you don't take these medications, we're going to kick you out. So at 16 years old, I didn't have any life skills really. So I really felt like I didn't have much choice but to take the medications that I knew. I didn't like the way they made me feel. I didn't think I needed them. And I also didn't really believe that I had this lifelong illness that these pills could cure. So for me, it was coming out of hospital and coming to terms with that in my family was, it was an ongoing battle between my family and I for a while until I just basically decided to trick them because I had no support on how to come off the meds. My family were just following orders. I mean, I don't fault my family. They were just doing what the doctors told them to do, and they believed they were acting in my best interest. And they were scared, they wanted me to be safe and they didn't want to see me have another episode. So not having any support coming off meds, and knowing that I would get kicked out if I was honest about being off meds, I just basically would take meds about a week before I would have my blood level taken, and I would take 2 times or 3 times the amount I was supposed to. And magically this worked. And I basically did that for 3 years. So, through like the, 3 weeks out of 4, I wouldn't be on the meds because I just wouldn't take them. And then when I knew my blood levels were getting tested soon, I would take them. And I'm still kind of amazed that worked. And of course, I just flushed the ones that were extra.
And so after you came out of the hospital, did you ever have any other kind of extreme state experience or crisis again, even though you weren't taking the medications as you were being told to?
I mean, I was a teenager, so, I had a boyfriend break up with me and I cried for 5 days and locked myself in my room. And, you could say I did have extreme states, but I think that all teenage girls and boys too have extreme states. I think it's part of being a teenager. So, my extreme states around being a teenager were immediately considered she's having another episode because I already had this lens, I was being viewed through this lens of, she has bipolar disorder. But I think had that never happened, my outbursts, my extreme states, whatever you want to call them, would have just been chalked up to teenage angst.
So you didn't have anything that was like a psychotic episode that ended up in the hospital after that?
No, I had some, I did drugs after I got out of the, street drugs after I got out of the hospital a little bit. And I'd be psychotic after I got out of the hospital, not taking lithium because I was smoking pot again, and that pot would make me psychotic. Every time I smoked pot, it would make me, to this day, if I smoke, which I don't, but if I were to smoke pot, I'm pretty sure I would become psychotic. So yeah, I did have, but not in the way that I had the time I was hospitalized. I didn't have like a 5-day, ongoing. And also I kind of knew what was happening. So if I knew, I learned how to see the thoughts. And I knew when to be quiet, basically. I knew when to not talk about what I was thinking and feeling. So basically, after I got out of the hospital, I was fine and I didn't have any other major episodes. And then when I was 18 and I was applying to go away to college, well, actually, when I got accepted into college and was leaving my family home, at that point, I just decided to tell my family because there was no point in having the charade anymore because they didn't have the leverage of kicking me out of the house anymore if I didn't take my medication because, 2 years had gone by where I basically wasn't really taking it and was fine. So I told my family, who I think were really kind of taken aback by the whole thing, but they took my word for it. And really, what could they say at that point? So I've been medication free since 18.
And so now you're a counselor and work with a lot of families dealing with similar kinds of situations to what you went through. Are those similar dynamics that you see, this conflict between the young person who says, look, I don't need these medications, I don't have a problem, and the parents who've been basically told by the hospital and the medical system that this is a disease and they absolutely need to be on the meds? That's something that you see a lot as a family counselor.
I see that a lot as a family counselor, definitely. When young people do decide that they want to taper off of medications completely, which inevitably most young people will decide because, of all of the side effects. There's sometimes it's acne, sometimes it's weight gain. The kinds of side effects are really not, nobody likes them, but during high school and younger ages, it can be a little bit more jarring even. So it's really common that the young person will want to come off the meds, and the family, they're taught to be an ally to the medical community. So when I'm working with families, I try and teach them to be an ally to their relative rather than to the medical community. And that's not to say that they go against what the doctors say, But if their relative is saying, listen, I hate this, I'm gaining weight, I have acne, I know it's supposed to be helping me with my mood or whatever, but I just don't want to do it anymore, that my quality of life sucks. I will work with the family around how can they support their relative with the life issues that their relative is facing at this time. And you know, the life issue that their relative is facing at the time might be that the side effects aren't worth the whatever gains that the medication is giving them anymore.
That's a really common power struggle. And you think about young people, people in teenagers, people in their 20s, there already are a lot of power struggles going on.
Raising teenagers as a parent is already a difficult challenge. When the medication becomes something that is a power struggle within the family, it can be really damaging to the relationship. And really, family members, ultimately, most family members want to support their relative in recovery. So what I'll often say to families is that their most important recovery tool that they have is their relationship. So while it might seem like what they really need to do is just get their relative on the meds because that will make them well, and that'll make sure they stay well, that's not always the case, because if somebody is really determined to go a different route, an alternative route, any kind of other route, and they're not getting support from their family, they're just going to turn to other people. Or they might not be able to find any other people like me and do something damaging to themselves. So, I mean, really, ultimately, you can't do any harm in supporting your relative around figuring out how to deal with the issues of their life, even if the issue is that they want to come off their meds.
Because maybe one of the compromises, if you have that alliance, is that, well, let's talk about going slowly off your meds. Let's talk about switching meds, or let's take this seriously, but doing it in a responsible way, rather than putting in the situation like you were put in of doing something that, because taking a double, triple dose of lithium before you get your blood draw in order to trick your parents into thinking that you're taking your meds. I mean, that's a pretty risky thing that you were pushed into doing because you didn't have that alliance with your family.
Exactly. And in terms of being an ally to your relative rather than the medical community, as I said, I don't mean you go against the medical community, but if you're supporting a young person who's questioning their diagnosis, they're thinking they might be able to handle their life, not identifying as someone with a mental illness for their whole life, you can be an ally in helping them to approach their psychiatrist in a way that is more like, you know, Dr. So-and-so, how can we work through this? You know, it's not about alienating medical professionals, but rather together collaborating. You know, that's where your strength as a family support person can really come in, you know, because a young person might not have all of the skills yet required for diplomatic, effective communication. You know, you can use your own skills to help them out. Those are helpful ways that you can be on their side.
Another difficult dynamic that families get into is when a young person is in a very wild, different reality, and they're talking about the FBI tracking them, or they're talking about them being connected to a prophet. This is where, again, that power struggle takes place. How do you work with families around dealing with a young person who's got those unusual beliefs?
That's a really great question, because again, what I will see commonly in families is especially with really far out beliefs, is that the family again becomes desperate to get the relative on their medication. So the family will try and convince listen to how sick you sound. You know, like, no, there are no cameras in the corner. Come on, you're really sick. We have to take you to the psychiatrist. You need to take your meds. And that's really damaging to the relationship too. Now, of course, your reality is very different than theirs. You don't see cameras. You're not seeing the strange, unusual things that they're seeing. But in fighting them on their reality and trying to convince them of your reality, you'll only damage the relationship further. So how I try and engage families around this situation is, how can they relate to the emotions behind what their relative is experiencing without necessarily tapping into the content of it. So, you know, the content is that the relative maybe believes there's the FBI watching them. So the emotion behind that would be fear. So the family doesn't have to say, oh, yeah, you know, I know the FBI are after you. It's not about that, but it's like, wow, you just look so scared right now. You know, are you okay? What do you need so you can feel less afraid? So, you know, you don't have to deny their reality, because likely what that'll do is alienate you from them, but rather you can engage them on a level of emotion.
I think one of the traps too is that sometimes when someone is medicated, they will be medicated to the point of just being blunted and tranquilized, and they may not be talking about those wild beliefs, so they might not be having those unusual states. What would you say to a family that says, look, we know that the medications work. When he just takes them, he stops thinking that the FBI are after him, or he stops having these weird beliefs?
I mean, it's hard for families when they're feeling burnt out. If a family their relative has been extremely boisterous and belligerent, and maybe there's been police involvement, the experience that the family member has caused a lot of ruckus within the family home, and finally they have peace and quiet, because the relative is on medication, and now everything's okay because, for the family, it can feel like relief, like, oh, I finally get a break, but that's not life. That's not, if somebody is so medicated that they're tranquilized, they're not really living their life, it gives the family a break. But that doesn't have to be the end game for their relative, that their relative is really passively just, not really out there living life. So the question is, once everybody has caught their breath, how do they engage with how does the whole family engage with their relative to help them to reach a quality of life, which might include medications, but not that many that they're tranquilized. But it's more, a question of quality of life, because the side effects to the meds can be so damaging that there's no quality of life left.
And this is something that comes up a lot, is that families are so stressed out and they really just want to control the person who's got the diagnosis. And I think often the work is about getting them to think about, well, what can they do to change themselves and work with themselves and help themselves in their own crisis, which is really what is going on as well.
Exactly. A lot of expectations and hopes get damaged. Unnecessarily, really. So, when someone in the family is diagnosed with a mental health issue, the family just, now my son or daughter will never be that doctor that I thought they would be, or, whatever. They'll never run the family restaurant, or, so all of these expectations get kind of just, people become brokenhearted, and even so much that the families will say that they're grieving for their relative, and I say, your relative is not dead, this horrible thing has happened, and they're figuring it out and they're going to move on from it, but they can still have a completely full, they can still run the family business. They can still be a doctor. Like, it's not over for them, so a lot of it is having compassion for families because they grieve. For them, it's real that they believe that their relative is going to be disabled for their whole life, because that's what the doctors have told them and that's what they believe. So there's a level of compassion for their grieving, but then there's also a level of educating them that, like, hey, wait a second, how did you come to believe that? Because maybe that's not true. Maybe you don't have to have low expectations.
And so much of this is just what any family goes through, because even without mental health diagnosis or hospitals or medications in the picture, sometimes your kid just doesn't want to be a doctor or doesn't want to run the family business. And that itself is a source of incredible stress and conflict in the family. And then realizing that, any parent has to go through a certain amount of letting go. I think this is something that gets short-circuited when that mental health diagnosis is there, because the parents get a feeling that they have to be the lifelong custodian. They have to be the guardian. If they let go, the consequences are going to be too dangerous, because, my son or daughter is incapable of learning how to be independent, how to take care of themselves.
That's exactly true. And it's counterintuitive to the recovery process, because what people actually need to do well and recover is they need to be empowered. They need to be actively contributing to their world, to their family, to their community. And those are a lot of things that get cut off when someone comes out of the hospital and they're in recovery. There's being in recovery, which is going out and living life. And then there's being in recovery, which is tranquilized on the couch. But a lot of what has to happen, I think, is just a very well-rounded education around what are the different possible beliefs of why this happened to your relative. Like, okay, so there's one narrative, and that one narrative is that they have a biological brain disease that they're going to have for the rest of their life. Okay, that's one narrative. Let's explore what some other narratives might be of why this happened and where their future could go. And it's not about saying that narrative isn't true. For some people, some people have the experience of being labeled with a psychiatric illness and finding it very helpful, and they take the meds. It helps them to dull their states. That works for some people. But it's not like that for everybody. So for those that it's not like that for, you have to broaden the horizon a little bit, and expand different possibilities.
And tell us about the kinds of work that you have done in terms of, you will get emergency calls really from families that are absolutely desperate. They're at the point of calling the police or calling the hospital, and say the son is just holed up in the basement room and won't come out and is only communicating in very bizarre ways. And then you would go into that home, and what would you do in that situation?
when I worked in Toronto at the Family Outreach and Response Program, we had the liberty to visit families in their homes. And often I would work with a family for a month or two, and I would hear, what's been going on for them and their struggles with connecting to their relative. If, for example, it is what you said, kind of hanging out in the basement, not coming out much. So I would have appointments with the family member in their home. Instead of at the office, I would go have appointments in their home. And then I would say, well, where is the basement? Can we meet near the door? And maybe the relative would hear us meeting and maybe not. That would be like the first time. And then the next time I would go, I would, do you mind if I just knock on the door? I'm just going to yell down and introduce myself and ask so-and-so if they want to come up. They would, yeah, I'm down here. No, I don't want to come up. And that would be session 2, and then there were times where I would sit outside of the door and I would say, hey, I'm here. I'm just going to be here for a little while if you want to chat with me. I've been talking to your mom for a couple months. I have no idea of your side of the story, but she's really just confused how to connect with you. And if you want to talk, I'm here. And I'll be here for 10 minutes. I'm just hanging out. So really non-threatening, just making myself available as a bridge sometimes between family members.
If you're just tuning in, this is Madness Radio, and our guest today is Krista MacKinnon. She's a family counselor who worked for 7 years with the Family Outreach and Response Program in Toronto, Canada, focusing on youth who are going through what's called their first break psychosis. Today, she is a mental health consultant, a counselor in private practice, and a trainer at practicerecovery.com. She is also a psychiatric survivor of a bipolar diagnosis. And how do you convey that you're not on the parent's side? If you've been meeting with the parents and you haven't been meeting with the person who's in the state, and really you have only heard their side of the story, and you're working for a mental health agency, how do you build that trust with the person who's going through the extreme state?
This is where my own personal experience has come in as a helpful thing, because I've found that in the instance that you described, for example, I would probably knock on the door and I would say, I'm Krista. I do work for a mental health organization, but I've had some similar experience as you, I was diagnosed when I was young as well. And sometimes just telling people that you've had the lived experience and you understand what it's like to have forced treatment and to not really be on the same page as everybody kind of disarms people. They're more curious about you, so they'll poke their head out and kind of check me out and maybe slam the door on me one day, but the next day, eventually people tend to come around. And I think really the reason they come around is more for curiosity than anything else. Like, who is this person that has also been diagnosed with something, is talking to my parents, When I was in the hospital as a young girl, I had never met anyone with mental illness, like big bad mental illness, except what I'd seen on Law and Order and things like that. So, my uncle at the time came to visit me and he's like, you probably don't know this about me, but I have a diagnosis of bipolar as well. And I remember being just blown out of the water, like, wow. So he has a job and a wife and he's got 2 dogs and he's an awesome guy and he's funny and everybody loves him. So it's okay. So sometimes when I say to young people, I've been diagnosed as well, just so you know, sometimes it's the first time they've met someone outside of the psych system who has had that experience. So that too kind of piques their curiosity and kind of builds a bridge.
Sometimes it seems that people who are going through states, especially young people, it's kind of a way of creating distance from the family. And do you think that a lot of the work that families need to do around recovery is really to learn better boundaries, like how to be supportive but not intrusive, how to be helpful but not overbearing or controlling?
For sure. And a lot of that is, again, the result of families believing that they have to be in the position of caretaker, where maybe they don't have to so much be in that position. So I've heard of families trying to put medication inside, the peanut butter and jelly sandwich and, telling their relative that, you really shouldn't go apply for that job. I know you really want to, but you're not ready, and things like that. So, as a parent, if you have a concern that your relative is not ready to go apply for a job, there are other ways that you can communicate things like that to them without stepping over their boundaries. I mean, this is, if the person is 15, there might be some different considerations, but I'm talking more young adult. A lot of the education work that I do around with families around boundaries is sort of like, what actually is your responsibility and what isn't your responsibility? And how do you tend mostly to your own affairs? Your own affair might be that you have extreme worry that your relative is going to go to this job interview and fail miserably and then become depressed. And that's your worry. That's your business. So your business is not them failing. Your business is your worry. So let's talk about your worry. So I try and engage it like that, because it can be really easy for there to be boundary confusions around families believing that they know what's best and telling their relative how to live their life. It happens in young adult teenage years anyway. It especially happens when there's a mental health issue complicating it.
So there's a learning process that's really a mutual learning process, and parents really need to learn some basic things themselves and not just be putting everything on the person who's identified as the patient, has the diagnosis. Oh, you've got to change, you've got to clean up your act, you've got to look at your stuff. Well, actually, it's a mutual thing. That part of the work is turning that around and saying, well, if I can't control my son or daughter, maybe I can get a little bit of control over my own life. Maybe I need help with that. And that's a big lesson that I think a lot of us have to face at some point. Just in general, there are going to be people that we're close to, that we love, that we have to be patient with. And if we do want some change, we have to look inside of ourselves. How do I worry less? How do I find a way to be more accepting? How do I find a way to spend time with them that isn't focused on fixing them or getting their problems solved, but actually just focuses on the things that I want to do, that I enjoy spending time with them around?
Exactly. And actually, there's a family education course that the families that I work with will take about recovery. And often near the end of the course, after they've been through the 8 weeks or 10 weeks or whichever, they'll often say, I spent some time with my son, for example. And, he said the strangest thing to me. He said, Mom, you're so much more fun to be with now. It's exactly for that reason, because a lot of the recovery education work for families is around managing their own emotions of worry, despair, maybe expectations being broken, and then learning how to relate to their relative as they are, who they are in the moment, and seeing their strengths and enjoying them for who they are. So once they start to practice their more hopeful self, the self that can see the strengths, once the families start to engage with their relative from that perspective, inevitably it's more enjoyable for the relative, and the relative likes to spend time with the family members more, and simple things like talking about a TV show will happen, which would have never happened if they were trying to tell them what to do and how to live their life and being more controlling.
That's a big part of family education as well, is the idea of a strengths-based approach. And tell us a little bit about that, because I think that's really key. I think that what happens sometimes in families is there's almost like a hypnotic trance that can take place where one person is identified as having a problem, and then all that person's life that fits into that idea of the problem, their weaknesses, their limitations, all that gets amplified and gets focused on. And pretty soon, the person is almost like a spell is being cast on them to enforce them into thinking of themselves in this very negative, down-putting way. Tell us about the work to sort of break that spell.
The Diagnostic Statistical Manual is a book filled of problems and symptoms. And when someone is given a diagnosis, they're put in a category of, you have these problems and symptoms, and that's why you have this particular diagnosis. When working with families around a strengths-based perspective, basically flips it around on its head, and rather than thinking of the problems and symptoms, you're actively instead looking for all of the positive traits and attributes and skills and strengths that a person has. So I'll actually do a strengths-based inventory with families, and I'll have them look at all the different positive character traits that can exist, and which ones do you see your relative as having, and in what ways do you see that particular character trait playing out in their life. So I collaborate with families to become detectives almost in looking for all of the positive traits and strengths that are sometimes hiding in their relative, because after something as damaging as a hospitalization and an autobiographical disruption like being labeled, the strengths kind of, sometimes they lay dormant, or they're harder to see because the person is really struggling with who they are, and maybe they're really believing that they're nothing but an illness. So the idea is to shine the light and really amplify anytime you see a strength, amplify it and make that become the priority.
You mentioned before that recreational drugs, pot and psychedelics, and then not sleeping and eating really contributed and triggered your own state, and maybe that was connected to some trauma and abuse that you had in the past. What's your sense of the different causes that lead people to have these first episodes, their first break with reality, their first crisis?
I think people have sort of emotional overwhelm for whatever reason. So, a lot of the time I think it is trauma related. And that's a subjective thing, so what might be really traumatic for one person might roll off of somebody else. So when I say trauma, some people think, well, nothing, my son was never abused, or my husband was never, there's no real trauma in the background, but trauma could be bullying that you never saw. And
one of the things I see is sometimes people are really upset and really hurt by a breakup. Like they have a huge relationship that doesn't go, that's really important, that's important in terms of their first love, or they're extremely involved in the other person, and that ends. And I think maybe the people around them don't realize how devastating that can be. But actually, that's a key part of why it is that they start to go into an extreme state.
Yeah, that's exactly right. I've also seen that a lot, that, somebody might easily say, well, that's just, she broke up with her boyfriend. Big deal. Well, no, for her, that might be an enormous deal, because she may have attributed her entire identity to being that person's girlfriend. So what is traumatic for one person is not necessarily traumatic to another. But I think that what makes people become psychotic or have a first episode of psychosis is really, it's a lot of things, racism, sexism, homophobia, poverty, oppression, all sorts of things. But ultimately it leads to a state of overwhelm that is so great that sort of as a protective measure, the person starts creating a reality for themselves that it just doesn't resonate with everyone else around them.
Do you think sometimes that the state going into an extreme state can be part of the whole transition from adolescence to adulthood? So in other words, a person kind of creates their own reality as a way of saying, I'm independent, I'm different than you. I've worked with a lot of people who the family may not be very religious or spiritual, but wow, the young person has gone into this incredible spiritual place where that gets called manic, or they get labeled bipolar. But there's a real important process going on of them saying, look, I'm a spiritual person. I do not speak the language that my parents do, and I want to live that independent identity as a spiritual person, but I haven't been able to really make it happen for me in the family. Maybe I'm not being listened to, or maybe I don't really understand what's going on because it's all new to me. And then this sort of extreme states, or what gets called a psychosis, erupts as a way of bringing that right into the fore that says, look, you've got to find a way to be independent of your family with your own perspective and your own beliefs.
I mean, for sure. That's why it's hard to say, where does this come from? I mean, the medical community will say it's just a biological brain disease and something chemically is happening in the brain, which is true. I mean, in a way, because, you're nervous about something chemical is happening in your brain. You're excited about something chemical is happening in your brain. I mean, yes, this is true, but life is more mysterious and magical and complicated than that. Okay, so maybe something chemical is happening in the brain, but what, why, in what way, and how can we change that chemistry? Are there other ways to change the chemistry?
I think a lot of the approach of the psychiatric survivor movement and maybe the consumer mental health movement has been to really separate from families and kind of get some distance and independence from parents, in part because so many of us have been hurt and damaged and abused even by our families. How do you work with a family when that is going on in the background? Maybe there's sexual abuse, or maybe there's been physical abuse, or even emotional bullying that's going on.
The nice thing about doing family work is that you get to see all the different pieces of the puzzle, so to speak. So oftentimes when I start working with a family and teaching them about recovery and ways to be recovery oriented, like for example, the strengths-based approach, a family will just realize that I don't do that at all. So often families will say things to me like, I've been doing everything wrong, or, oh, I can't believe how horrible I've been. Once they start learning about how to be more supportive, once they learn the skills of support, often they'll realize the ways in which they haven't been supportive. Sometimes that looks like family sessions where there are a lot of apologies happening, which is really nice to see. When someone's diagnosed with a mental illness, it's like, okay, now we don't have to understand them because they're just mentally ill. So finding ways to make sure that that doesn't happen, so that the other person's voice is heard and there's equality. When there is some very serious physical abuse or sexual abuse happening in the family, it's something that needs to be addressed separately first. It may be that the father who is physically abusive or the mother who is sexually abusive, the relationships are so damaged that it's not in a place where, yet where the family can come together. I mean, where there's sexual and physical abuse in a family, teaching the skills of strengths-based approach and how to have good boundaries, and it won't even resonate because the pendulum is so far on the other side. So, it may be that a different kind of therapy is needed, more specific to, cracking down sort of why those abusive behaviors are playing out. How can you heal your own self so that you're not being abusive?
And sometimes the abuse goes in the other direction too. Sometimes it's the person with the diagnosis who is being emotionally abusive to the parent. What would you do with that situation?
Yeah, I mean, that does happen. So again, and it's about boundaries go both ways. So one thing is that, within psychosis, I think if a parent or a relative wants to support someone that they love who's having extreme states, one thing that I say is like, you might have to become more comfortable with the expression of strong emotions. So sort of stretch your boundaries a little bit, maybe allow someone to yell and scream a little more than you might normally, because the expression of strong emotions is maybe what is required in the moment. But on the other hand, you absolutely do not have to accept abuse. So how do you know what your limits and boundaries are? I worked with this one mom who, her son, every time she would try and communicate with him, she would go to his house, knock on the door, he would answer the door, and he would just scream at her and scream at her and scream at her and scream at her. And she sometimes would scream back, and they would have big arguments. And then, she didn't want to do that anymore. So she said, I don't know what to do. I show up at his door and he screams at me. So one of the tools that I like to work with families is around compassion building. So it can be difficult to sit with people who are expressing strong emotion, particularly if it's anger directed towards you specifically. And in this case, it was very important to this mom that she stay connected to him. So we talked about her next time she went to his house, doing a meditation with her breath, wherein she would breathe in all of his anger. He's yelling at her and screaming at her, and she would stand there and breathe it all in. And in her mind's eye, she would breathe out calm, peace, tranquility. So she tried it. And what happened was he screamed and he screamed and he screamed, and she didn't react. She just stood there and practiced her breathing in his anger and breathing out peace and calm. And she said it was really hard and it took a lot of focused effort on her part, and it was a little bit scary for her, but she did it. And what ended up happening was he kind of petered out. He yelled and yelled and yelled, and then he saw that she wasn't going anywhere and she wasn't responding. So he got it all out, and after 5 minutes or so of yelling, he kind of toned it down, and the yelling got calmer and calmer, and he kind of just collapsed into her arms and gave her a hug. And this was like a huge breakthrough for her. I mean, she could not believe it because he had not, physically held her, touched her in a long time. And, you wouldn't expect that to be the outcome of a bunch of anger, screaming and yelling directed at you. But that was it though. He gave her the hug and he closed the door. I mean, and sometimes family recovery is like this. She found a way to not experience it as abuse and to work through it with him. And then they were able to connect. Their relationship got much better, actually, after that. And he ended up becoming quite well. But that, right when he was fresh he was hospitalized against his will. She was the one who put him in hospital. So a lot of the anger, it wasn't coming out of nowhere. He had legitimate reasons to be upset. So
I know from doing this work myself, this can be very demanding, very challenging. Often there's issues of suicide, or the police are involved, or people are desperate. What is it that really sustains you? What is it that inspires you to keep going in doing family mental health recovery work?
I love when I see people having light bulb moments. Those moments where you see they're starting to see a situation differently than they had previously, and that changes everything. I find it very inspiring when I start working with a family and they're very stuck and there's a lot of anger and the whole thing feels stagnant. And then you kind of take all the different people in the family and, talk to each of them based on what each of them need. And you see them come together in a way, these light bulbs, suddenly the son understands the mom's perspective and the mom suddenly understands the son's perspective, and they try something different and the whole thing shifts. I always say that families are like mobiles, in the wind, like one piece will turn just ever so slightly and then they all move. So it's quite a beautiful thing to watch. And also, it's inspiring for me to be able to give families the education that my family never got, because my family they're wonderful people. They would have done anything to support and encourage me in my wellness, but they were not taught how to do that.
And bring us up to date about the work that you're doing now. You're no longer with Family Outreach and Response in Toronto, and you've started a new organization, practicerecovery.com, which I've been very privileged to be involved with.
In my as an adolescent, but also as an adult, I'm kind of a social media nerd, and I've found a lot of support myself in online communities for all sorts of things. I was a mom who didn't have a lot of support as being a mom raising kids in Toronto. I, wanted to lose weight at one point, and I joined an online group. So I'm kind of a nerd this way, and I love social media. So often we would get asked at Family Outreach and Response Program from all around the world, people asking us about our content and our curriculum. And, we were really busy. Like, we were happy to share it, but we were just busy. I mean, we didn't have it in a clear, organized way to share internationally with people. So I got the idea to start PracticeRecovery.com as a way of bringing recovery education online. And I had experienced meeting wonderful people online through different community online courses and community networks. So I just thought it was a perfect way to bring this body of knowledge online. And I partnered with Mother Bear and Family Outreach and Response Program to bring this family recovery curriculum online.
And Krista, we're just about out of time. How do people get in touch with you and find out more about the online recovery courses that you're offering?
Anybody that wants to reach me can reach me through email at krista@practicerecovery.com, or you can visit the practicerecovery.com website. Some of the family curriculum that I've been talking about in this interview is available on a website called family.practicerecovery.com.
Krista MacKinnon, thank you so much for joining us today on Madness Radio.
Thank you. It was my pleasure.
You've been listening to an interview with Krista MacKinnon. She's a family counselor who worked for 7 years with the Family Outreach and Response Program in Toronto, Canada, focusing on youth going through what's called a first break psychosis. Today, Krista is a counselor in private practice. She's a mental health consultant and a trainer at the online recovery organization PracticeRecovery.com. She's also a psychiatric survivor of a bipolar diagnosis. That's all the time we have on Madness Radio. Thanks for tuning in. You've been listening to Madness Radio, Voices and Visions from Outside Mental Health, co-sponsored by the Icarus Project, Portland Hearing Voices, and Freedom Center. Madness Radio is hosted by Will Hall, and producer is Leah Harris. Madness Radio is based at KBOO in Oregon and can be heard on FM stations on the Pacifica Radio Network. Listen on the internet at madnessradio.net and on iTunes. Contact us at radio@madnessradio.net.